Hello, I'm Ashley, the engineer at Andover Norton. Now, of all the Norton Commandos, the one question we get about the rear brake, by far more than any other query, it's the rear brake on the Mark III Norton Commando. Now, the first time you approach this brake system, it can be a bit daunting and a little bit different from anything you may have worked on a modern bike. The principle's still much the same, but there are some things you need to consider when you're looking at this Mark III rear brake setup. Now, the first thing is the hose. We've had numerous phone calls, about 3 in about the past 18 months, where I can't bleed my brake, there's no fluid getting into the caliper, but when I disconnect the hose, it's coming from the master cylinder. It's the hose that's blocked. We've had about 3 cases of that where these hoses have been blocked. I wouldn't mind betting that what they're trying to do is bleed a brake where the hose is most probably the best part of nearly 50 years old. Realistically, these don't last any more than 10 years. And they're dead easy to check. You can just pull the spring back and look to see if they're perishing. We see it here occasionally where they do start to perish. It's a rubberized item and it does go through a lot of abuse when it's in use on the road, because it's got to count for every bit of movement from the road to the actual fixed point. Don't chance it. If you think it's getting 10 years old, get rid of it. And like you say, the cure date's on it as well. So realistically, it should be swapped out from 10 years from that cure date anyway. Dead cheap, easy to replace. Some people fit a braided version. Yes, they do work. Realistically, on a rear brake, do you need it? Because you're not going to lose any extra performance from fitting a braided hose or over a rubber hose. This gives you more than enough braking capacity on the rear than you'd ever really need. So I always use the cheap rubber hose. On the front I use a braided hose because I need to have the system actually at this maximum efficiency. But for the rear, rubber hose is plenty good enough. Now the next one is setting up this rear master cylinder. That's how it is when it's set up on there, but there's certain things you've got to do to get to this step. The manual is very good in what it explains. Now this piece screws in to this piece. Pretty straightforward. If you've got an old system, count how many turns it is away from the actual grub screw to undo this from here. You've got to get the grub screw actually on the flat. We have seen it where people have just got it in so many turns and then just hit the grub screw down on the thread. Normally what happens when they go to undo it, it takes the thread off with it, so you need a new mounting. Now, the reason why you count that amount of turns to undo it on your old system is the fact you've got a push rod which sits in here. So now the push rod, we get close-up photos, as you screw this in, you will be screwing the piston in here against this push rod. If you screw it in too far, you're effectively screwing on the rear brake. But what you can do is move the piston to a point where it covers the rear hole on the master cylinder. Once you've covered that rear hole, it doesn't matter how much you operate this, it's never going to get oil down the outlet port to the caliper. Something to bear in mind. So that shows why the number of turns here is important. If you're setting up a fresh one, we have the routine for that. I can send it out to you. But realistically, you just screw it in until it just touches this rod. So there's no movement in the rod. And I believe it says about doing another turn so you can line up the grub screw underneath with the slot on the master cylinder itself. You then have to be able to blow air through this port so it comes out of this after port on the master cylinder. This is a really important check. It's in the AP documentation as an important step to take, because what you need to do is make sure that you haven't set up your new system covering that hole, so the piston's down here, not back here near the actual stud. So you can see that's the first part of the equation. If you get that bit right, there's a good chance you're going to get the brake bled and it's going to work fine. The next step is setting up the turnbuckle and the nut. This would go through like this. The nut would go on. So it goes on like you expect to see it something like that with the rubber boot. I've left out the rubber boot and the lock nut to give you an appreciation of what the rest of the setup procedure involves. Now, the turnbuckle goes on here. This makes up the rest of the turnbuckle with a clevis. Now, as you can see with that like that, you've got some things to consider here now. If you turn the actual rod, you can then force this out, which forces your lever up and down. What you can do is if you get it too far, you can put the lever up, and of course as you start to screw this, it will carry on operating the actual piston in the master cylinder. What you're then trying to do is to screw this in so your pedal height comes down to a point where you've still got a little bit of play there, so you know you're not pressing on the piston, blocking off that after port, which is the critical port on the master cylinder. Once you've set that up and bled the brake, you can then bring this locking special nut down to the distance in the AP publication, or I think it's also in the workshop manual as well, and I think it's about 9mm plus or minus a bit. We believe it was there for some sort of anti-lock braking device, so you couldn't put the brake on too hard. This day and age, does it actually work? Would owners actually need it? I don't really know, but I generally find that the figure they set is generally not enough to operate the rear brake sufficiently, especially when you've got it on the heavy interstate. So I always wind it back a little bit more to give me the braking I feel comfortable with. Something worth considering if you want to set your back brake up and you think, well, it's ineffective, just adjust that by another half a turn or so and see what extra you get. Now, when you're bleeding the brake, always wind this right out the way so you're getting the maximum stroke on the piston in the master cylinder to be able to bleed the brake to get the brake to work. Once it's bled, you can set this up and then adjust it to how you feel comfortable and lock off here. Now, one of the things is some people don't like the brake pedal height on a Mark III. Sorry, you can't really change that unless you then start changing the amount of turns in here, but remembering if you're doing so to make sure not to cover that hole, in which case you can then slightly adjust the brake pedal height to get it to suit your toe and boot position. Generally what you find is when you set this up, the brake pedal on a Mark III sits a little bit lower than you're usually used to, and if you're just stepping off a modern bike where the pedal was probably bang perfect right under your toe, touch it, brake operates, when you get on the Mark III, even though the brake's on the same side as a modern bike, you're going to notice there's a fair bit of movement there before I find and operate the pedal. Not really much you can do about that. And likewise, sometimes with the Mark III, always good to have it tucked down out the way a little bit, because you'd be surprised how many people ring up saying my rear brake disc has gone blue. That's because they've been riding with the foot on the pedal. Yeah, it does happen, and I've done it myself in my early days as well, believe it or not, so I do know you can do it. Now, that explains the things to look out for on the Mark III rear brake. It's somewhat different than the earlier one with a cable. The cable is simple. You can adjust the height of the pedal, and to compensate you can adjust the neural nut at the back in the actual trunnion to be able to adjust the operation of the brake. So you've got two forms of adjustment. On the Mark III system, you really haven't got that much of adjustment really. You've only got the adjustment to operate the brake, but not so much for the height of the pedal. I hope that explains some of the things to look out for on the Mark III rear brake system. It is the one we get the most phone calls about. Usually on a basis we get about one a week or one a fortnight, so it goes to show how common it is. But realistically, once you understand what you're looking for, you should be able to overcome any problems that you encounter. Thanks very much, and if you need anything else like the documentation from AP or the manual, let me know and I'll get it sent out to you. Thanks very much.